The dropship came in low over the vain capital at the kind of hour when the moons were still up and the cities pretended to sleep. Corporal Marin Voss watched the skyline through the porthole and tried to remember the last time she'd slept in a bed that wasn't moving. She couldn't. The message that had pulled her off her routine station rotation at Outpost Galler 9 had been marked Coalition Diplomatic Priority Alpha, which was a classification level above anything she'd personally received before, and the text of it had been 5 words. Queen Veth Corps. Medical liaison required. The other 6 medics in the Coalition's interplanetary division all had longer experience logs and more vain language hours and actual advanced degrees in xenobiology. She'd thought briefly that the message had been misaddressed. Then she'd read the time stamp. It had been sent 11 minutes after whatever had happened to the Queen. Every other available Coalition medic was 12 to 40 hours away. She was too. That was why she was on this dropship instead of any of them. Not because she was the best, because she was close. The city from above looked like everything vain architecture always looked like to her. Crystalline and deliberate, buildings that grew from the ground the way formations grew from cave floors, not constructed but cultivated, shaped over centuries by a species that thought in terms of generations, not quarters. The landing pad was on the roof of what she'd been briefed was the Sovereign's residence, and as the ship settled, she could see the honor guard standing in formation below, and she thought, they're standing exactly like people who have received bad news and are waiting for the bureaucracy to confirm it. She'd seen that posture before, in field hospitals, on the faces of medics who'd already decided someone wasn't going to make it, the body already writing the paperwork. She grabbed her kit and went down the ramp. The honor guard captain greeted her with a formal bow and the standard opening of the vain diplomatic reception, a phrase that translated, her bead told her, as the sovereignty receives you in the spirit of the shared journey. She responded with the Coalition reciprocal, something her language trainer had drilled into her that translated approximately as in the shared journey we are all the same distance from the horizon, and followed the captain into the residence. They walked for a long time. The Sovereign's residence was not designed for efficiency, it was designed for meaning. Every corridor encoded something, rank, history, alliance, memory, and being led through it was itself a form of communication. She was being shown things. She was being told things about where she was being brought, and about what was expected of her once she arrived, even though no one was speaking. The bead in her ear picked up fragments as they walked. 2 attendants discussing the announcement schedule. A secretary querying someone about the protocol for rescinding a diplomatic reception in the event of royal cessation. A guard in a side corridor saying something in the old dialect that the bead couldn't parse, but whose tone she understood the way you understood any tone that meant grief without yet having permission to express it. She counted the steps. She always counted steps in new environments. 12 years of field medicine had taught her that when you needed to move fast, it helped to know the architecture already. They were taking her to the resonance hall. She knew this from the briefing she'd read on the dropship. If the Queen had experienced a cessation event, the Collegium Medicis would have convened in the resonance hall, which was where the Vane conducted the formal transition protocol. Not a morgue, not exactly a hospital, something in between, filtered through 1,000 years of ritual. The chamber she was finally escorted into smelled of ozone and burning copper, and the light came from nowhere she could identify, a sourceless blue-gray glow that made every surface look like the inside of a held breath. 7 Vane healers stood in a loose ring around the central dais. They were tall, all Vane were tall, 8 feet of pale exoskeleton and slow, deliberate movement, and they wore the spiral-carved breastplates of the Collegium Medicis, senior healers, the most respected diagnostic minds in the Vane sovereignty. They held their hands clasped at their midsections in the gesture she'd learned meant, a thing is finished. On the dais the Queen lay still. Her name, the part of it that could be expressed in human phonemes, was something close to Veth-Kor, and she was the 39th sovereign of the Vane succession, and she was, according to the 7 healers, dead. She had been dead for 11 hours. Marin set her field kit down on the floor and crouched beside it, and didn't say anything yet. She'd learned, in 4 years of operating as medical liaison, that the first 30 seconds in any room told you more than the next 30 minutes of questions. What those 30 seconds told her: the Queen's thoracic plating was moving. Barely, almost nothing. The kind of movement that looked like a trick of the sourceless light. But she'd been watching thoraxes move or not move since she was 22 years old, and she'd learned to read the difference between stillness and stillness with something left in it. And this was the second kind. The bioscan wand was in the outer pocket of her kit. She didn't reach for it yet. First, she needed to understand the room. The nearest healer turned. The bead identified him from her briefing files. First voice Sahran, senior practitioner, 46 years of collegium service. He looked at her with eyes that had no iris, just a solid pale gold field, and his expression translated as intrusion acknowledged but not welcomed. "Liaison Voss," he said, "we are grateful for the Coalition's courtesy in sending a representative. The Queen's transition has been confirmed by the full collegium. We are currently in the preparation phase before the announcement." A pause. "Your presence here is an honor to us. We ask only that it be observed with the dignity appropriate to the moment." "Of course," Marin said. "Her thorax is moving." Silence. The particular silence of people who had heard something and were deciding how to respond to something they already knew, or possibly something they had decided not to know. "The micro-oscillations you may be observing," Sahran said carefully, "are residual, post-cessation biological cascade, involuntary systemic echo. Our instruments have confirmed cessation beyond the point of intervention." "What instruments?" "A beat, the Vane Vital Harmonic Array, 17 integrated sensors, the most advanced diagnostic platform in the sovereignty. It has returned cessation readings for 11 hours without variance." A second healer moved forward, older, her breastplate carved more deeply, breastplate insignia of the second voice. "Liaison Voss. I understand that human medicine is thorough, and we respect the Coalition's practices. But the harmonic array's cessation determination carries both clinical and legal weight in the sovereignty. The Queen has been declared concluded. The announcement will be made within the hour. What you are proposing." "I'm not proposing anything," Marin said. "I'm saying her thorax is moving." She kept her voice neutral, even, the same tone she'd used 100 times with personnel who had already made up their minds about a patient. "May I approach the dais?" Sahran stepped in front of her. Not aggressively, the Vane rarely moved aggressively. They had subtler ways of closing doors, but decisively. "Liaison Voss. You must understand that what you are asking to do is not simply a clinical question here. It carries meaning. In the Vane understanding, the concluded are to be approached only in reverence, not in examination. To continue applying instruments to a concluded person is to deny them the transition they are owed." "I understand," she said. "I'd still like to approach." "The harmonic array. How long has the array been running its confirmation cycle?" she asked. "Since the cessation event, 11 hours and has the reading changed at all in 11 hours? Any fluctuation, any variance in the cessation signal?" A pause, something passed between Sahran and the second voice. Not words. Just the kind of exchanged glance that happens when two people are about to decide whether to be honest. "The reading has been consistent," the second voice said. Consistent means it's been doing what biology does in cessation. The same means the instrument is showing the same reading it produced at hour 1. Those are different situations. Which is it? No one spoke. She looked at Sahran directly. First voice, Has the array's reading changed in 11 hours? There was a minor technical issue with the secondary sensor cluster 4 hours ago, he said at last. The words came out carefully, evenly, in the voice of someone who had been practicing the phrasing. It was resolved. How? The array was reset to its last stable reading state. Marin stood very still. The secondary sensor cluster was producing variance, she said. It was reset to match the primary reading. The variance was inconsistent with. First voice Saharan. She said his name the way she said names in field triage, when a soldier was trying to tell her he was fine, and she needed him to stop talking long enough to actually look. The sensor that was showing something different from the cessation reading was reset to show the cessation reading. Is that correct? The silence that followed was the longest one yet. The variance was, he began. Is that correct? Oh, yes, he said. She absorbed that. She let it sit for a moment. Then she said, I would like permission to approach the dais. I am not asking to overrule the collegium. I am asking to look. The second voice moved. Not to block her, she stepped to Saharan and placed one elongated hand against his thoracic plating. The bead translated the gesture, with some uncertainty, as, let her prove it and be done with it. Saharan stepped aside. Marin crossed the floor. The queen was larger than she'd seemed from across the room. 6.5 feet of vein physiology, built along the same lines as her people but denser, the exoskeletal plating layered in a way that spoke of generations of succession rites that weren't purely ceremonial. She knew from her briefings that the vein queen was a biological designation as much as a political one. Her body functioned as the harmonic center of the collegium's network. When she was gone, something changed in the sovereignty at a level deeper than succession. Which meant that if she was wrong, if the queen was truly concluded, she was about to examine a corpse in front of 7 senior healers who would remember this until they died. She activated the bioscan wand. The first pass took 8 seconds. The display lit up 6 biomarkers, 5 in ranges she could only partially interpret. She was working from comparative xenobiology studies, not direct vein clinical training, but the 6th she knew. The 6th measured electrical signal propagation through biological tissue. In cessation, in every species she'd ever worked on, that marker went to 0. 0 and flat. In the queen of the vein sovereignty, right now, it was reading 0.003. Not 0. Not flat. 0.003, holding steady. The trace on her display aligned so thin and quiet it would look like instrument noise to anyone who hadn't spent 4 years learning to be suspicious of noise. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at the queen's thorax, then back at the display. Then she reached into her kit. The compound she pulled out was called Hydropan 7. It was a coalition-developed compound designed to interrupt null cascade shock in human soldiers who had technically flatlined in cold exposure situations. It had never been tested on vein physiology. She had 3 years ago, during a posting where she'd had a great deal of uninterrupted time, and a particular habit of thinking through things she probably shouldn't think through, written 3 pages of notes on whether Hydropan 7 interaction mechanism would translate to the vein THRVL circuit, the cardiovascular analog that drove vein biology. She had never published those notes. They were theoretical and underpowered, and based on a structural comparison she'd been only 60% sure was sound. 60% was not the kind of confidence level she normally needed to inject an untested compound into the body of a sovereign. Liaison Voss. Saharan was directly behind her. She hadn't heard him cross the floor. What you are holding is not a vein-approved treatment compound. No, she agreed. Coalition protocols do not authorize. I know. Then I must ask you too. First voice, she didn't turn, look at my display. A long pause, then the sound of him moving to see the screen. She waited. The sixth biomarker, she said. The signal propagation reading. What does 0 look like on a Vane harmonic array? He didn't answer immediately. She gave him time. 0, he said finally. It is a flat baseline, no signal. And what does this look like? Another pause. It is very close to 0, he said. It's not 0. The variance is within the margin of. What margin? She asked. The margin on an instrument that was reset 4 hours ago to show the last stable reading, which was from 11 hours ago. First voice, your array stopped watching her 4 hours ago. It's been showing you a memory. She kept her voice level. I'm showing you what the room looks like right now. The argument that came back from Sahran was measured and careful and not stupid. The Collegium had 17 sensors. The harmonic array had never produced a false cessation reading in 3 centuries of use. The signal she was describing was so close to 0 as to be indistinguishable in clinical terms. The distress caused to a concluded person by intervention was, in vain understanding, a real harm, not a theoretical one. She listened to all of it. She understood all of it. Then she said, first voice, if I administer this compound and she is truly concluded, nothing changes. She remains concluded. Your ceremony proceeds. You tell no one that a human medic with a field kit tried to wake a dead queen because there's nothing to tell, it won't have done anything. She paused. If she is not concluded. The array says she is. The array, she said very carefully, is showing you what it looked like 4 hours ago. Silence. May I administer the compound? The silence stretched. It was broken by a new voice. Let her. Marin turned. In the doorway, she hadn't heard it open, stood a figure in black exoskeletal armor, scratched and dented in a dozen places, the insignia on her shoulder plating identifying her as Queen's personal guard. She was shorter than the healers. She had been standing very still, in the posture of someone who had been standing very still for a very long time. Let her, the guard said again, to Sahran, not to Marin. Sahran, I have been standing at that door for 11 hours telling you that my guard bond has not been severed. I have told you this 11 times, and you have told me 11 times that instruments supersede testimony. Very well. Let the human's instrument speak. Sahran looked at the guard. Vethsan, the guard bond is. It is physiological, she said. You know this. Every healer in this room knows this. When a queen concludes, her first bound feels it, a physical severing, an absence. I have not felt it. Her voice was steady, but her hands, Marin could see from here, her hands were shaking. Not fear, something past fear. The shaking of someone who has been holding one belief against a room full of other beliefs for 11 hours straight. I have felt only silence, and silence is not the same as absence, first voice. You know this too. Sahran looked at the queen, then at Vethsan, then at Marin. Something moved across his expression. The bead couldn't name it, but Marin had been reading faces under stress for long enough to know. This was the look of a person who was beginning to consider a possibility they had, for reasons that made complete sense to them at the time, decided to stop considering. He stepped aside. Marin turned back to the dais. She found the gap between the queen's second and third thoracic plating segments. She knew it from Vane biomedical texts, a subdermal pathway rich with vascular analog tissue. She set the injector there. This may not work, she said to the room. Her biology may be too far into suppression for this to reach her. I need you to know that going in. I need you to know that I'm not promising anything. I'm following a reading that isn't 0. She paused. And I need to know that if it doesn't work, we're all still in this room together and the ceremony proceeds with my full respect. No one responded, but no one moved to stop her. She pressed the trigger. The compound went in. The injector's pressure gauge dropped correctly. The Hydropan 7 was in the queen's tissues, And now Marin had approximately 90 seconds to find out if she had made one of the best calls of her life, or one of the worst. She set the injector down and watched the bioscan wand. Behind her, the room was not quiet. The argument that had been suspended came back in pieces. Second voice saying something formal and authoritative, Sahrin responding, Vethsan's voice underneath both of theirs, lower and more controlled. Three different people in a room all wanting different versions of the same outcome. The Queen alive, the Collegium right, the Guard not insane, and none of them able to be fully themselves until someone's reading changed. 0.003. 0.003. She held her breath without meaning to. 0.004. She let the breath go. 0.004. Then back to 0.004, not a drop, a hold, the number sitting exactly there as if it was thinking about it. Then 0.005. Then 0.006. First voice, she said. The argument behind her continued. First voice Sahrin, louder this time. Still going. Everyone stopped talking. They stopped. She held the display so Sahrin could see it from where he stood. Watch the sixth marker. They watched. 0.006, 0.007. A pause that felt like a held breath, like the whole room was a held breath. Then 0.008. Then 0.01. Vethsan made a sound. The bead didn't translate it. It came through raw. A string pulled tight for 11 hours that had just been released. 0.012, 0014, 0.017. What is happening, said the second voice, not a question. The voice of someone who already knew and was trying to decide if they were permitted to know it. Cascade interruption, Marin said. Her THRVL circuit went into suppression mode probably during the initial injury event, whatever caused the cessation alarm in the first place. A survival response. Her body shut everything down to the absolute minimum to try to protect the core functions. Your harmonic array is designed to detect cessation. It found what looked like cessation. It reported cessation. It was correct about what it found. She paused. It was wrong about what it meant. 0.019. 0.023, 0.027. She wasn't dead, Vethsan said. She was in a state so close to cessation that your best instruments couldn't distinguish between the two. Marin let out a long, slow breath. But close is not the same. Not yet was still on the table. The number kept climbing. At 0.04, the Queen's thorax moved. Not the barely there oscillation Marin had noticed from across the room. A real movement. A real breath. Long and labored and not beautiful, not even close to beautiful, the breath of a body that had been a long way down and was very slowly coming back up, but present. Unmistakably present. The 7 healers of the Collegium Medici stood without moving. Marin sat down on the edge of the dais because her legs had decided they'd carried their share of the weight, and it was time to transfer some of it to the floor. She looked at the display. She looked at the Queen's thorax rising. She thought about her mother, who had been a trauma surgeon in Bremen, who had told her once, "The worst thing a doctor can become is certain. Certainty is the first cousin of inattention." She thought about that for a moment. Then she stopped thinking about it and just watched the number climb. Sahrin crossed to the array panel. He stood in front of it for a moment, reading data she couldn't see. Then he turned to the second voice. Something passed between them, not words, just the look of two people arriving at the same conclusion from different directions. The second voice went to the panel and began the recalibration sequence. The sourceless blue-gray light in the chamber shifted fractionally, warmer, more immediate, as 17 sensors came back online and pointed themselves at the living body on the dais instead of the 11-hour-old memory of it. The room organized itself. That was how it felt to Marin, Not a sudden transformation, but an organization, the way a room reorganizes itself around a changed fact. Healers taking new positions, running the protocols appropriate to a patient instead of a concluded person. The second voice calling readings. Sahran moving to the supply cabinet and then to the Queen's side with equipment Marin couldn't name. Vethsan crossed the room and stood at the foot of the dais. Parade rest, eyes forward, hands at her sides. If she was trembling, she'd stopped. Marin looked at her. "What's your name?" "Vethsan," the guard said, "first bound to the Queen." "How long have you been on duty?" "Since she collapsed, 43 hours. Marin absorbed that. She looked at the dented armor, the scratches across the shoulder plate, the particular set of someone who had been standing still and fighting hard for a very long time. "You said it to them 11 times. "Yes." "And they told you the instruments supersede testimony." "Yes." She thought about what to say. She thought about the specific cruelty of being right and being unlistened to. Of watching the room close around a conclusion you knew was wrong and having nothing, absolutely nothing, to offer against it except the fact of your own knowledge. "You did the right thing," she said. Saying it again. Vethsan looked at the Queen. "What else was I going to do?" That wasn't a question either. They sat in the particular silence of a room where a crisis had passed, but no one had permission yet to call it past. Marin watched the bioscan numbers. The collegium worked. The Queen breathed not easily, not without effort, but with growing conviction, each breath slightly more committed than the last, the body remembering that this was what it did, that this was the thing it had been built over generations to do. 0.089 at the 40-minute mark, 0.134 at the hour, 0.201 at 90 minutes. First voice Sahran came to her at the hour mark. He stood in front of her for a moment without speaking. Then he made a hand gesture she recognized, the same one the second voice had made, the "let her prove it and be done with it" gesture, but it read differently now. The bead offered something between acknowledgement and "I owe you something I don't have the right word for." "The array is reading her at stable minimum function," he said. "The second voice believes she will recover." "Good," Marin said. "The Hydropan 7, you tested it on vein physiology before." "Never." A pause. "You were not certain it would work." "No. But you used it anyway." She looked at him. "I was certain about one thing. The number on my screen wasn't 0, everything else was a guess, but the number was real." She paused. "A 60% guess, if you want the exact figure." Sahran looked at her for a long moment. "You administered an untested compound to the Queen of the Sovereignty on a 60% confidence level." "I administered it because, not administering, it had a 0% chance of helping." He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it, the way a person absorbs a piece of reasoning that is completely correct and that they find uncomfortable. "The sensor cluster," he said. "The secondary sensor. That reset 4 hours ago. I want you to understand." He stopped, started again. The reading it was producing was inconsistent with the primary cessation signal. The second voice made the determination that the inconsistency represented a sensor malfunction. Given the context, the formal declaration, the preparation already underway, a malfunction was the simpler explanation. "I know," Marin said. "You are not," he paused. "You are not angry." "No. You have cause." "Maybe," she leaned back against the wall. "But I've made the same call, in the field. You get a reading that doesn't match what everything else is saying, and you're in a situation where the alternative is too large to sit with, and the reading starts to look like noise. It's not evil. It's what happens when you've been certain for long enough that uncertainty stops feeling like a warning and starts feeling like a problem to correct." She looked at him. "I've reset a few sensor clusters in my time. Not literally. But close." Sahran was quiet. "That is a generous way to say what happened." "It's an accurate way," she said. You believe she was concluded. You were conducting a transition ceremony with full institutional weight behind it. A sensor throwing off a variant signal in that context doesn't look like a discovery. It looks like a malfunction. That's a real thing. That's a real cognitive trap. She paused. The thing I want you to think about, not today, not this week, but eventually, is what the protocol should be when the instruments disagree with each other. Because right now your protocol is apparently to reset the disagreeing instrument. Sarin looked at the ceiling. Not upward in thought, the vein didn't have that gesture. He looked at the ceiling the way she looked at her hands when something she'd assumed was uncomplicated had turned out to be more complicated than expected. There will be, he said slowly, a review by the Collegium of this evening's events. I'd expect so. I would request that you be available to contribute to that review, your observations, your instrument readings, the notes on Hydropan 7. Of course, she paused. First voice, the secondary sensor, the one that was throwing a variant reading before the reset. Can you pull its logs from before the reset? A longer pause. They may have been cleared in the reset process. Can you check? He turned and went to the panel. She watched him work, hands moving through a sequence she couldn't follow, the array interface responding in vain script she could read slowly but not quickly. After a few minutes he turned back to her. Partial records remain. The secondary cluster was reading a signal propagation value of 0.002 at the time of the reset. 0.002. She thought about that for a moment. It was reading her. Yes. For how long before the reset? He checked. 4 hours and 11 minutes. From hour 6 of the declaration to hour 11 when the cluster was reset. 4 hours. The sensor had been watching the Queen, watching the thing that wasn't zero, the thing that meant something was still trying, for 4 hours before someone had reset it to match the story the room had already agreed to tell. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Sarin looked at the logs for a long time. Then he said, quietly, without looking up, First voice of the Collegium Medicis should not have to have this pointed out to them by a human medic with a field kit. No, Marin said, they shouldn't, she paused, but they did, so here we are. Another silence, shorter, yes, here we are. On the dais the Queen breathed. At the 2-hour mark she opened her eyes. They were different from the healers, not the solid gold field but something multifaceted, deep, the eyes of an organism built to look at a lot of things simultaneously and derive meaning from all of them. They moved slowly. Ceiling, Collegium, Vethsan. When they found the guard, they stopped. Vethsan's stillness broke in the smallest possible way. A single exhaled breath that was audible across the chamber. The Queen spoke. Old vein, something the bead couldn't reach. But Vethsan responded one word and that one the bead caught. Present. Not here, not alive. Present, still here, still yours, still at the door. Second voice briefed the Queen for several minutes. The Queen listened, then moved her eyes to the array readout, to her own thorax with its sensor patches, to the room. The methodical survey of someone reconstructing a picture from available evidence. Then her eyes found Marin. Marin stood up. She didn't know the protocol for being looked at by a vain queen. She stood straight and kept her expression professionally neutral. You are the coalition medic, the Queen said. Her voice was weak, precise. Liaison Voss, Coalition Medical Division. I was sent as a courtesy representation at your ambassador's request. You were sent because you were close, the Queen said. You were the only one who could arrive in time. Yes. And you were not trained in vein medicine. No. And you used a compound designed for human physiology. Yes. And it worked. Marin considered her answer for a moment. It interrupted something. Your body did the rest. It had been trying to do the rest for 11 hours. It just needed the cascade broken. The Queen was quiet. The healers around her were quiet, in the way of people who understand they are witnesses to something being recorded somewhere more permanent than a log. "My healers declared me concluded," the Queen said. "Yes. They are very good at their work." "They are," Marin said, and meant it. "They are exceptionally skilled. The harmonic array is a remarkable instrument. The protocol they followed was sound." She paused. The situation they found themselves in was one that their protocol wasn't designed to account for. A cessation state so close to true cessation that every instrument designed to detect cessation found it. There was nothing in the protocol for what happens when almost cessation looks identical to cessation. "Until a human walked in with a different instrument," the Queen said. "Until a human walked in who didn't know that your instruments had already decided, who just looked at what was in front of her." Marin kept her voice even. "That's not skill. That's just, I didn't have the context that told me what the answer was supposed to be, so I looked at the answer I found." The Queen looked at First Voice Sahran. Something passed between them in the old dialect, long and quiet, and Sahran made a gesture the bead translated as something between apology and formal acknowledgement, the vain way of saying, "I was wrong, and I am saying so in a register that means it." "In the vain language," the Queen said, returning to Marin, "the word for concluded and the word for irreversible are the same word. They have always been the same word. We have not needed to distinguish between them because our instruments have not in 3 centuries required it. A breath, still effortful, but real. You are telling me that perhaps we should begin." "I'm telling you there's a number on my screen that wasn't 0, Marin said. "What you build from that is yours." The Queen made a sound low, resonant. The bead didn't name it, and Veth San, for the first time in 43 hours, sat down on the floor. The Collegium worked through the next hour with the focused precision of people correcting an error, and they knew it, and they were not going to stop until it was corrected completely. Marin stayed out of their way. She sat against the wall, refilled the status log on her comm, inventoried her kit, wrote a 2-line research recommendation. Hydropan 7 cross-species compatibility study, priority track. She had evidence it worked on vein THRVL circuits. She hesitated on that. It was going to generate an enormous amount of paperwork. She sent it anyway. At the 2.5-hour mark, Sahran came back to her. "The Queen wishes to formally request Coalition Medical Division support in designing a supplement to the harmonic array's cessation protocols. One that accounts for the suppression state you identified this evening." He paused. "She is also requesting that the preliminary research notes on Hydropan 7 cross-species interaction be submitted for publication through the Coalition Vein Medical Exchange Program." Marin blinked. "She's been awake for 30 minutes. "She is the Queen," Sahran said. The same words but different now, not explanatory, more like, "You'll understand eventually." "The notes aren't very good," Marin said. "They're 3 pages, theoretical. The comparison I was working from is." "The Queen's exact words," Sahran said, "were, they do not need to be good, they need to exist." Marin looked across the room at the dais. At the 39th sovereign of the Vein succession, who had been declared dead 7 hours ago, and was now awake and thinking about protocol reform and publication pipelines. "All right," she said, "tell her I'll publish them." She left the resonance hall when the bioscan readings were solid enough that she trusted them to stand without her. 0.287, and climbing in a curve that had stopped being uncertain. The Collegium was running the array live and watching, and the Queen was awake, and Veth San was finally sitting down, and there was nothing left in the room for Marin to do except be in the way. The guard walked with her to the outer corridor, still in her dented armor. Looking, now that the immediate thing was over, exactly like a person who had been awake for 43 hours doing something very hard. "You need to sleep," Marin told her. "I know. That's a medical recommendation. I'll sleep when the second voice's shift begins." A pause. The bead picked up something quiet and sidelong in her voice that translated approximately as, "I appreciate what you did." "You were at the door for 11 hours, Marin said. "That's what held the room together long enough for any of this to matter." "I told them 11 times. "Yes, and the 11th time they finally let me through." She paused. "It took 11 times because the first 10 built the pressure. You were doing the work, I just—" "You walked in and looked," Vethsan said. "When looking was what needed to happen." Marin thought about arguing and decided not to. "Yeah." "Thank you," the guard said. Marin walked out into the vain morning. The moons were down. The city was beginning to move in that particular early-hour way of cities that had kept running through the night, and were now easing into the day with the slight self-consciousness of things that have been watched. The landing pad was 11 minutes from the resonance hall. She counted the steps without meaning to. Her comm bead buzzed. The liaison desk, finally, she didn't answer. The Hydropan 7 vial was in her kit, almost empty. She'd need to log the usage and requisition a replacement, and write the formal incident report and the research report, and apparently prepare 3 pages of theoretical notes for publication in a joint coalition vein medical journal. She thought about that. She thought about the gap between writing something you believe 60% of and having it be right. She thought about the number 0.003. In 11 hours, in a chamber lit by a sourceless blue-gray glow, with 17 sensors and the most experienced diagnostic healers in the sovereignty, not one instrument had been pointed at the Queen in 4 of those hours. The array had been showing a memory. The room had been attending to a conclusion. One person had been watching. One guard, in dented armor, saying the same thing 11 times into a room that had already decided. That was what had mattered in the end. Not the compound, not the wand, the saying it again. Marin thought about that all the way to the landing pad. She thought about all the rooms she'd walked into and out of, all the times someone had been at the door saying something 11 times, and she'd been one of the people who hadn't listened until the 11th. All the sensor clusters that had thrown variant readings she'd reset to match the story she already knew. The dropship was waiting. The dawn light was copper and warm and wrong in the way all alien mornings were wrong, beautiful but not quite in the register her body expected beauty to be. She climbed the ramp. She sat down. She answered the liaison desk. "The Queen of the Vein Sovereignty is alive," she said. "The cessation declaration has been rescinded. Coalition Vein Medical Cooperation Framework is being expanded. Please route the attached research request through Medical Division priority channels. And please tell whoever coordinates the journal exchange program that I have a submission for them. 3 pages. Not very good." The liaison officer asked her if the submission was significant. She thought about 0.003 on a small screen in a room that had stopped looking. "Not very good," she said again, "but it exists, and apparently that's what matters." She closed the channel and looked out the porthole as the dropship lifted, watching the vein capital fall away below her, the crystal spires and the cultivated streets and the sovereign's residence where, in a chamber with no obvious source of light, a queen was breathing with more and more conviction, the body remembering that this was what it did. Almost nothing, she thought. That's what they had missed. Almost nothing looked the same as actually nothing if you weren't watching carefully, if you had the right instruments all pointed in the same direction, if you'd already written the conclusion and were just waiting for the administration to confirm it. The line between the two was the thinnest line she knew. She was going to spend the rest of her career learning to see it. Not yet, she thought, as a practice, as a discipline, as the thing you said before you accepted anything that couldn't be undone. Not yet. Look first, then decide. The formal review convened 12 days later. Marin had been back at Outpost Galler 9 for 11 of those days, finishing the rotation she'd left mid-shift, writing the incident report that kept getting longer no matter how many times she trimmed it, arguing with the Coalition Medical Division's Research Coordination Office about what preliminary notes meant in the context of a formal publication request from the Vane sovereignty. The research coordinator had used the phrase extraordinarily unusual scientific process 4 times in one message, and Marin had resisted pointing out that the process had worked. The review was held in a chamber adjacent to the Resonance Hall, smaller, plainer, lit by actual fixtures rather than the Vane architectural ambience. 7 seats on one side of a long table, the full collegium, 1 seat on the other side, hers. She arrived 11 minutes early. She always arrived early. She sat in the single chair and thought about the geometry of it, 1 person across from 7, which was either the geometry of an inquiry or the geometry of an accounting, and she supposed she would find out which. Sarin opened the proceeding. The Collegium, he said, had reviewed all available records from the night of the cessation event, the harmonic array logs, the secondary sensor cluster data, recovered in partial form, the 0.002 reading documented for 4 hours and 11 minutes before the reset, the bioscan WAN data, which Marin had transmitted to them at their request, every second of the climb from 0.003 to 0.289, the case notes from the attending healers, the testimony of Vethsan, submitted in writing in the old dialect and translated by the Collegium's own linguist, which detailed 11 separate statements to Collegium members that the guard bond had not been severed, and 11 separate responses that the instruments superseded personal testimony. The Collegium had also reviewed, he said, the protocol governing cessation declarations and the treatment of concluded persons. They had identified 3 specific gaps. Marin listened. Gap 1. No protocol for sensor disagreement. When multiple sensors or sensor clusters produced inconsistent readings during a cessation event, the current protocol defaulted to the primary array reading without requiring documentation of the inconsistency. Gap 2. No protocol for resetting an active array during an active cessation determination. The reset performed by the second voice had been within the technical parameters of the array's maintenance documentation, but had not been contemplated in the cessation protocol. Gap 3. No protocol integrating non-instrument testimony from qualified witnesses during a cessation determination. The guard bond severing experience was documented in Vane medicine as a reliable indicator. It had no procedural weight. Marin had been taking notes. She stopped taking notes. You've already written the reform protocols, she said. We began drafting them the morning after, Sarin said. She looked at the 7 of them. 7 healers who had declared a living queen dead and had spent 12 days sitting with that, not defensively. She could tell the difference between a review conducted to assign blame and a review conducted to fix something, but forensically, finding the exact shape of the error so they could close it. The Coalition Medical Division is sending 2 research physicians, she said. They should arrive in about 3 weeks for the Hydropan 7 compatibility study and the suppression state identification project. She paused. They're going to want access to the array data, all of it, including the reset logs. They will have it, the second voice said. The second voice, who had made the call to reset the sensor cluster, who had been present at every session of the 12-day review. All of it. Marin nodded. Liaison Voss, Sarin said. There is a question I have been unable to answer in 12 days of reviewing the documentation. I want to ask it directly. Please, she said. When you arrived at the dais and activated your instrument and saw the 0.003 reading, what did you think? Not what did you conclude. What did you think in the moment before you reason it out? She considered the question. It deserved a careful answer. I thought that's not 0, she said, before I thought anything else. Before I thought about what it meant or what to do about it, Just, that's not zero, that's something. She paused. I was trained by a surgeon who told me that certainty was the first cousin of inattention. I've spent 12 years being suspicious of readings that tell me exactly what I expect. Not contrarily, not looking for the exception because I want there to be one. Just checking. Always checking. Not walking past a number without asking if it's right. She looked at her hands on the table. 0.003 is a very small number. In almost any context, it means nothing. But in the context of trying to decide if something is over, almost nothing is a completely different category from actually nothing. And I've seen people treat them as the same. I've seen it go wrong. So I don't anymore. The second voice spoke. The sensor cluster was reading 0.002 for 4 hours before the reset. I looked at that reading and I determined it was noise. Instrument variance. I was incorrect. She paused. I was incorrect because I had already determined what the answer was. And when an instrument told me a different answer, I concluded the instrument was wrong rather than the determination. Yes, Marin said. How do you prevent that? Marin thought about it. You build a protocol that forces you to document the disagreement before you resolve it. You require a second confirmation before you reset anything. You give the guard bond testimony a procedural weight, so it has to be formally addressed rather than informally dismissed. She paused. But those are structures. The underlying thing, the thing that makes you reach for the reset, the inconsistent sensor option before you reach for the what if the sensor is right option, that's harder. That's about what it costs you to entertain a possibility you've already ruled out. In your case that night it cost a great deal. The declaration had been made. The preparation was underway. The announcement was scheduled. Opening that door again was enormous, so the sensor looked like noise. And for you, the second voice said, it was not enormous. I didn't have a declaration to unmake, she said. I walked in fresh. No sunk cost, no story to protect. She paused. That's not a virtue. I'm not claiming it as one. It's just what I had that you didn't. Not better training. Not better instruments. Just no prior conclusion. The room was quiet. Then Sarin said, the reform protocols include a provision for mandatory coalition medical division consultation in all future cessation events involving members of the sovereign's household. It was the Queen's explicit request. Marin looked at him. She wants a human in the room. She wants someone in the room who hasn't grown up inside the collegium, he said, who might look at a number that isn't zero and ask why. Marin thought about what that meant, about being the outside eye, the person with no conclusion to protect. She thought about all the times in her career she'd been the new person in a room full of people who'd been there longer, and how sometimes that was a disadvantage and sometimes, it was the only thing that let you see the room clearly. Tell her I'm honored, she said. She wasn't performing, she meant it. The review concluded an hour later. She walked out of the chamber into the same long corridor she'd been led down 12 days before, the same encoded meaning in every surface, but she read it differently now. She understood more of what it said, still not all of it, probably never all of it, but more. Vethsan was waiting at the end of the corridor. She was in clean armor now, still black, still marked with the Queen's insignia, but repaired, the dents hammered smooth, the scratches buffed out. She looked like she had slept. She looked like herself, Marin supposed, though she'd only ever seen her in the other state. The Queen wishes to speak with you before you depart, Vethsan said. I was going to stop by anyway, Marin said. They walked together through the residence, taking a different route than the one the honor guard captain had used 12 days ago. Shorter, more direct. The path, Marin suspected, that people who actually lived and worked here used, rather than the ceremonial route for diplomatic arrivals. She decided that meant something. The Queen was in a smaller room than the residence hall, a working room, with a low central table and cushioned platforms arranged around it, and the kind of organized document piles that said someone used this space to think in. She looked better than 12 days ago, which was a low bar, but she also looked better than Marin would have expected from someone who had been in null cascade suppression for 11 hours. The Vane were, apparently, resilient in ways the medical literature hadn't fully quantified yet. The Queen gestured toward one of the cushioned platforms. "Sit, liaison Voss, please." Marin sat. Vethsan positioned herself to the left of the Queen's platform and assumed the parade rest she wore the way other people wore comfortable clothes. "The review went well?" the Queen asked. "Very well. The Collegium is thorough. The reform protocols they've drafted are good." Marin paused. "Better than good. They address things I would have suggested and things I wouldn't have thought of." "Sovereign is very good," the Queen said, simply. "He made a serious error. He is taking it seriously. Those are not contradictory things." "No," Marin agreed, "they're not." The Queen looked at her for a moment. "In the vain understanding of medicine, there is a concept that I find I have been thinking about since I woke in the resonance hall. We call it the shape of a conclusion. Every diagnosis, every determination has a shape, the boundaries of what it includes and what it excludes. The Collegium is trained to find the shape of a conclusion precisely and hold it clearly." She paused. "What I had not considered before this event was that the shape of a conclusion can be wrong, can exclude things that should be inside it." "Yes," Marin said. "The shape of cessation in our understanding excludes the suppression state you identified. It should not. And so when the suppression state was present, our conclusions formed correctly within an incorrect shape were incorrect." A pause. "I am not being gentle with myself about this. My Collegium nearly announced my death to the sovereignty. They were working with the tools they had." "Yes. And now we will build better tools." The Queen's eyes, multifaceted, attentive, the eyes of something built to track many things at once, held on Marin steadily. "I want to ask you something that I did not ask in the resonance hall." "Please." "When you administered the compound, when you pressed the trigger, were you afraid?" Marin thought about it. The honest answer, yes. "Of what?" "Of being wrong," she said. "Of spending whatever credibility I had in that room on a 60% guess, and the guess being wrong. Of the administration and the coalition liaison office spending months explaining why an untrained medic injected an untested compound into a vain queen at a ceremony." She paused. "Of looking like the worst kind of human, the kind that comes in from outside and decides they know better than the people who have been doing something for 3 centuries, and turns out to just be arrogant." She let out a breath. "It's a real fear. I take it seriously. The number of humans who have done real damage in alien contexts by assuming their way of seeing was automatically better, that's not a small number." "But you pressed the trigger," the Queen said. "The reading wasn't 0. That was enough. For me, that day." She looked at her hands. "I don't know if it's always enough. I don't know where the line is between not 0 is signal and not 0 is noise. I have a better guess now than I did 12 days ago. I'll have a better guess in a year than I do now." She paused. "But that's the work, I think. Learning to know the difference. Not finding a rule that tells you. Just paying attention for long enough, carefully enough, that you start to hear the difference between the two." The Queen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "In the Vane oral tradition there is a story about the first Queen's healer. It is very old. In the story the healer encounters a situation where every sign indicates that the patient is concluded, and the healer's training and experience and the testimony of every witness confirms it, and the healer is about to step away and she hears something. Not sees, hears. A sound so small it should be impossible. And she goes back and she looks, and the patient is not concluded." "What was the sound?" Marin asked. "Or he doesn't say." The Queen's expression moved in a way the bead translated, uncertainly, as something like a smile. "The scholars have argued about it for centuries. Some say it was a breath. Some say it was a heartbeat. Some say it was something the healer carried inside herself, some particular attunement she had cultivated over a lifetime of watching and listening. Some say the story is not about the sound at all, but about the returning, about turning back toward something you had decided was finished. Marin thought about that. What do you think it was? I think, the queen said, it was something that was not zero, and a healer who had been trained to notice the difference. They looked at each other across the low table. I want to ask one more thing, the queen said. You said in the residence hall you said not yet was still available. What did you mean by that? Marin considered the phrasing. She had said it in the moment, not thinking, just the words that were there, but she knew where they came from. In human medicine we have a concept we call the threshold, she said. The point past which an intervention can no longer change the outcome. Before the threshold you have options. You can try things. After it you're just managing what's already been decided. She paused. Not yet is shorthand for you haven't crossed it. The threshold is still in front of you. You have time. There are still things to try. She paused again. It's also what I say to patients when I need them to keep fighting, when they've decided they're past the threshold and they're not. Not yet means stay, keep trying. The door is still open. You don't have to decide it's over just because everything looks like it's over. The queen was quiet for a long moment. Say it to me again, she said, as you would say it to a patient. Marin looked at her. At the 39th sovereign of the Vane succession, who had been 11 hours in null cascade suppression, declared dead by 7 of the best healers in her civilization, and was sitting across a table 12 days later, asking a human medic to give her the words that would make her understand what had happened. Not yet, Marin said. The queen closed her eyes. When she opened them, she said, we have a phrase in the old dialect, veth en suur. It means approximately the door that did not close. She paused. I am going to add your phrase to the Collegium's formal record of this event, as a translation, not yet and veth en suur. The door that did not close, Marin said. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. Then, that's better than my version. You will need both, the queen said. Yours to know when to act, mine to know what happened afterward. A pause. Thank you, Liaison Voss, for the compound, for the reading, for the not yet. Marin stood. She placed her hand over her sternum in the coalition gesture of respect to a sovereign, not a bow, but an acknowledgement. You matter. What you are matters. Thank you for staying, she said, for keeping the thing going that I could measure, for not crossing the threshold while the room was looking the other way. The queen's expression moved again, the uncertain almost smile. I was not going to give up, she said. I am the 39th sovereign. We are not a line of people who give up. Marin walked out of the residence and into the vain afternoon copper light, the sky its familiar wrong shade of blue with her kit on her shoulder and the calm bead quiet for once and the landing pad 11 minutes away. She counted the steps as she walked. She always counted steps. It was a habit she'd had since her first field posting, when a medic she'd trained under had told her, you never know when you'll need to run back. She counted all 11 minutes worth. The dropship lifted at the start of the evening, and she watched the city fall away below, and thought about thresholds and guard bonds and numbers that weren't zero, and about a sensor cluster that had been reading 0.002 for 4 hours before someone reset it to match the story the room had already decided to tell. She thought about all the stories rooms decided to tell, about all the 0.002s that got reset. She thought about what it cost to say, hold on, wait, look again. And then she thought about the queen saying not yet back to her, trying the shape of the words in a language not her own, and the way the words had sat in the room between them like something that had been waiting to exist. The dropship cleared the atmosphere and the city disappeared, and the stars came in, vast and clear and indifferent, and Marin settled into her seat and pulled out the 3 pages of notes she'd written 3 years ago that she'd been about to publish for the first time in a joint coalition Vane medical journal, and read them for the first time in a very long time. They were not very good, but they existed, and apparently that was enough.